Welcome to our Canadian Guidelines for Post-COVID-19 Condition webinar series, or for CAN-PCC. And we're very excited to have you here today and to hear the presentations that are scheduled. Before I introduce our speakers, I first want to quickly introduce myself. I'm Dr. Robbie Newlaat. I'm the co-lead investigator of the CAN-PCC project, and I'm at McMaster University, and I'm happy to be your host or moderator today. Today, we have some excellent presenters from our project's teams. Also, before we get started, as we always do, we want to provide the land acknowledgement. It's important to acknowledge that the work of CAN-PCC takes place across Canada, a land that is the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of many Indigenous nations. From coast to coast to coast, these lands are home to the First Nations, Inuit, Métis peoples who have stewarded them for millennia, and we honor their rich cultures, languages, traditions, and histories. For our McMaster University presenters, we recognize that McMaster sits on the traditional territories of the Mississauga and Haudenosaunee nations within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon, Wampum Agreement. Some reminders about rules and housekeeping for today's webinar. Please submit your questions using the Q&A feature in this session. While we'll try to keep an eye on the chat, the Q&A is your best way to reach us with your questions. Wherever possible, slides are presented in both English and French, as you can see. For more complex slides, we'll present the English first, followed by the French. A recording of the webinar will be available on the CAN-PCC website, which is canpcc.ca, a few weeks after today. Long COVID, or post-COVID-19 condition, PCC, so we'll use both terms, is a relatively new and complicated illness affecting different parts of the body. What is important to know is that long COVID shows up in different ways in different people and can be mild or severe and lasting for various lengths of time. In CAN-PCC, we are applying the World Health Organization's definition of long COVID for adults as well as children. Summarizing the definition for adults, long COVID usually appears within 3 months from the acute COVID-19 infection and lasts at least 2 months. Symptoms can vary and can change or worsen over time and significantly impact daily life. We do acknowledge that other potentially different definitions are available. So long COVID is very common, and around 400 million people globally are estimated to have had or have long COVID. The impact on people in Canada is also substantial, as 1 in 9 adults, or 3.5 million adults in total, have experienced long-term symptoms after COVID-19 infection, and among them, 600,000 missed days of work or school, so their daily life is seriously impacted. Long COVID has been associated with over 200 symptoms and conditions. Among the most common symptoms are fatigue, brain fog, pain in different parts of the body, sleep problems and shortness of breath, and post-exertional malaise. However, many other symptoms can be present, and combinations of multiple symptoms and conditions are common. We have seen, and you have seen, many stories and anecdotes in the media of people sharing their experiences to raise awareness about this condition, and this is one example.
I wanted to start by sharing quotes from 2 other patient representatives. This is not going away, and with me being on the wait list for the medical clinic for over 270 days, that means there's still a need. From Jennifer. From Kimberly, another patient representative said, as a person with post-COVID-19 condition, I'd like to see clinicians consider these guidelines in their practice. I would like to encourage sensitivity when patients are expressing those concerns and would like to see the public use the guidelines to best inform and empower themselves in their health decisions. I just wanted to take this opportunity to share a bit about my personal experience with PCC. After having my first infection at the very beginning of the pandemic in late February 2020, I began to notice several changes relating to my energy levels, how often I was getting sick, my inability to no longer be able to tolerate high temperatures, and many symptoms related to my respiratory and cardiovascular systems. I went from being a very active, busy individual, both at home and work, who was cycling over 50 kilometers and swimming at least one several times a week, to having to push harder than I ever had before to accomplish a fraction of what I was able to before, and which got progressively worse the more that I pushed. After going to my GP several times throughout the course of that year with concerns about the changes I was experiencing, I was dismissed and told that I was getting older, needed to consider less intense sports less frequently, and to consider adding yoga and meditation in regularly. Fast forward 5 years and a total of 6 COVID-19 infections later, despite being extremely cautious, and my life has been turned upside down. I'm no longer able to push through anything physical or cognitively without experiencing severe repercussions due to PEM. I've been off work and on disability leave since January 2022, and my ADLs have been drastically modified to be able to cope with all of the chronic conditions that I've been diagnosed with as a result of PCC. And most of all, my family has had to learn to adjust to the monumental changes in what I'm now able to join them in. I have had to learn to educate myself on conditions that I had never previously heard of, to learn how to advocate for my system in order to navigate a medical system, and how to deal with all the changes that I've experienced. What inspired to get me involved with CAN-PCC is that through my process of education and advocacy, I was met with numerous roadblocks and realized the gaps in knowledge and acceptance around PCC and post-viral illnesses in general. I experienced times of resistance and doubt by the medical community due to a lack of measurable data, and I wanted to be able to use my experiences to help provide real-life perspective and contribute to the understanding, education, and awareness of PCC in policy creation and throughout the medical community. While working on the guideline team, I was always asked for my opinion and felt valued. I was asked how my lived experiences related to the recommendations being discussed, as there's still so much that we don't yet understand or have answers to. In conclusion, I wanted to leave a message of hope for patients, health professionals, and policymakers to take away from these recommendations. To the patients, you are not alone, and what you're experiencing is real. Continue to learn and advocate for yourself. To the medical professionals, be open, empathetic, and validate your patients. Take time to reflect and consider alternative pathways. To the policymakers, PCC has changed lives. It's estimated that as of August 2024, over 400 million people worldwide have been affected by PCC, and that number continues to grow daily. Please continue to foster learning, understanding, and create opportunities to find answers, acceptance, and treatments to this debilitating, life-changing illness.
I'll continue from here, and I think that was incredibly powerful, and appreciate your participation in the process, your story, and very much also want to echo the validation that you shared to people experiencing this. The Public Health Agency of Canada graciously funded this work. It wouldn't have been possible without that funding to provide easily accessible and high quality guidelines on post-COVID condition and facilitate their use, the knowledge mobilization to multiple settings. We've led this from a McMaster University Grade Center and Cochrane Center standpoint, but it's actually been an incredibly collaborative, diverse group from across the country and beyond, with over 150 individuals helping from coast to coast to coast in Canada, coming together for this effort. We had divided the work into 6 guideline teams. They included, each guideline team included people with lived experience, allied health professionals, physicians, economists, researchers, nurses, public health professionals, a variety of individuals. And again, one of the critical pieces was really centering this work on the lived experience of people with PCC. And here are some of the patient partners who've been really driving this work and helping throughout. We sought to have balanced representation, engagement of key groups and collaborators, a transparent process, independent management of conflicts of interest, which is critical for trustworthy guidelines, and we had standardized training that helped to inform and level set the experience of everyone coming into the process.
So here you can see the structure of the project with the various groups. And you can see, as already explained, the Michael G. de Groot Canada McMaster Grade Centers are the central team. And I and Jordi and several faculty members are on the executive committee that are leading the overall project. We get advice and input from an international advisory board with many international collaborators that we have worked with for quite a while. And this group, with our team at McMaster that is executing and managing the whole project, we also set the scope and focus. And so the guideline development group is the overarching group that makes sure guideline recommendations are being finalized. So they do this based on the work by 6 guideline teams. And these teams also involve various experts for diverse representation. And they draft the recommendations that you have seen in our surveys. We gather a lot of comments. That then goes to the GDG, or the Guideline Development Group, and they review that, discuss that, perhaps suggest changes based on the comments, and they finalize it. This is done for recommendations, and quality indicators will also be added for that purpose. Now, all of this work is based on evidence synthesis, and we have 6 evidence synthesis teams across the world, as well as information specialists in Canada that we work with, that have searched for and prepared the relevant evidence that these guideline teams and GDG have used to make the recommendations. In terms of evidence synthesis, we also had an international group of collaborators that are also working on long COVID guidelines, and we've gathered their input on the evidence that we've identified to ensure there is consistent interpretation of this evidence, and we don't end up with wildly different recommendations across the world. And Canada has a leading role by means of this. Then, to wrap up the structure here, the organization, we have a knowledge mobilization committee. And this is a very important committee that takes the recommendations, creates products for dissemination and implementation, and works with various groups to do specific implementation projects throughout Canada. And we will explain a bit more about that. We also have a public member panel that has been providing input on various aspects and steps within the project. And what is not clearly shown in this graph is that the Equity Oversight Committee, shown here to the side, really was involved in the overall process. So equity was considered pretty much throughout our whole process and throughout our whole project.
To develop the guideline, the final recommendations that are released, we selected and prioritized topics. We developed draft recommendations. We underwent public consultation and genuinely listened to this input, and sometimes really changed in quite significant ways, and then finally released recommendations.
You can see here all the steps by the groups that we previously showed in our project structure. We have received valuable input from the government, patients and public and health organizations who expressed interest in our project, primarily for topics and question selection, and as well as the monthly batches of draft recommendations that we are sharing. All project groups also contributed to these steps, as you can see, and they have further some specific selected roles in specific steps in this whole process, as you can see here. I want to note that in practice, in the longer term, developing recommendations is more of a cycle, whereby, so not as linear as you see here, whereby new evidence may be integrated and the recommendation can be updated if needed. I also want to highlight that throughout this whole process, at several steps, we are translating our products and our outputs and our surveys And eventually we provide our recommendations and related tools and products all in English and French.
We had a very important equity lens on the process, including representation, but also a research evidence synthesis lens of health equity for various equity-seeking groups. This was quite critical. And ultimately across prevention, testing, diagnosis, pharmacological, non-pharmacological, neuropsych, peds and adolescent, and health system topics, these 6 guideline groups, we've developed or will have developed nearly 100 recommendations.
Canada's Chief Science Advisor, Mona Niemer, also explained that while scientific studies are undertaken and the evidence base grows to fill knowledge gaps and inform practice, individuals living with PCC or long COVID require care, support, and treatment now.
An absence of evidence or very low certainty evidence does not negate the importance of an issue. And it does not necessarily mean that we shouldn't be doing something. It just means that there is certainly more nuance that is needed in the recommendations. So you will see through here many conditional recommendations. That doesn't mean that people shouldn't be doing it, but it does mean that what we identified in the literature evidence out there was perhaps of lower certainty. The difference between benefits and harms was perhaps small, or the values of and preferences of people that the guidelines apply to may vary. And so it doesn't mean that people shouldn't do it, but it does mean that some people would not want to follow the recommendations. So a nuanced understanding and perhaps healthcare professional discussion is needed in implementing the recommendation. For a person seeking care, again, most people would want to follow a conditional recommendation, but many would not.
To stand up for a total of 10 minutes. And during this time, we're looking at heart rate and blood pressure at different intervals. So it's a test that can be done in the outpatient clinical office. It doesn't require really specialized equipment except for the blood pressure cuff and the pulse oximeter, or you can count the heart rate. So the benefits of this test were considered as moderate versus the harms being trivial. So that was, clearly the balance of effects favors the intervention or the test. We did not think that there'd be uncertainty or variability in how people would value the main outcome of the test. So therefore, we thought that the test would be acceptable and feasible. We did want to point out, though, that with equity, that there could be some variability, as there could be some issues with different equity-seeking groups accessing either the clinical visits for evaluation, or of course, if there's situations where an individual cannot stand up. And in this case, an alternative test, for example, could be the tilt test, but this recommendation is really centered on the 10-minute standing test. That was the evidence that was evaluated. Next slide. Again. All right, so the next test is, should a troponin versus no troponin be used in adults with suspected PCC who have cardiac or respiratory complaints? Again, because that might be able to point us towards a cardiac complication, which we know there's an increased risk in the year following COVID-19 infection. Next slide. And so the CAN-PCC collaborative does suggest the use of the troponin or high sensitivity troponin I test in adults with suspected PCC and cardiac or pulmonary symptoms. It's a conditional recommendation based on very low certainty of evidence. Next slide. And here is our evidence to decision table. Again, the benefits and the harms were both considered small, but again, a lot of weight was placed on ruling out or diagnosing a potentially very serious complication. Next slide. So the next test, goes in a sense, same idea as with the troponin, is should a B-type natriuretic peptide, or the BNP, or N-terminal pro-B-type natriuretic peptide, or NT-pro-BNP, versus no BNP be used in adults with suspected PCC who have respiratory or cardiac complaints. And again, because individuals who have heart injury or heart failure can have symptoms that are common with PCC, such as shortness of breath, chest pain, palpitations, fatigue, and swelling in the lower extremities. Next slide. So the CAN-PCC collaborative suggests using the B-type natriuretic peptide, or BNP, or the NT-proBNP in adults with suspected PCC and cardiac or respiratory symptoms. This is a conditional recommendation based on very low certainty of the evidence. Next slide. All right, here's our evidence to decision table. Again, even though the benefits and the harms are both judged as being small, there's still more weight towards the intervention because of the fact that we do not want to miss a potential serious diagnosis. So very important to diagnose and rule out serious complications. Next slide. Okay, so now we're getting a little bit out of the cardiac tests and onto other sorts of tests. So one that is a test of a lot of debate is whether or not the CRP, or C-reactive protein, versus no C-reactive protein should be used in adults with suspected PCC. And this is based on the rationale that there could be patients with PCC, they could have mitochondrial damage, some muscle mass loss, there could be some frailty, and this could be resulted from increased inflammation, which in some cases we can observe by measurement in the blood CRP. Next slide. Oh, just one back. Yeah, so the CAN-PCC collaborative actually suggests not ordering the C-reactive protein, or CRP, versus ordering this test in adults with PCC. So this is a conditional recommendation against the test based on, again, very low certainty of evidence. Next slide. Yeah, so the benefits were considered to be trivial. This was largely based, again, on our framework, where we considered, does this test really increase suspicion of PCC? Does it help us really diagnose a comorbidity or rule out a comorbidity? Will a change in management occur as a result of this test? And just in enumerating some of these aspects of the framework, you can see that the CRP, because of its non-specificity, does not help us in any of these aspects of the framework. That's why the benefits were deemed as being trivial, and then the harms small. It is a blood test, but it could increase your risk of overdiagnosis. And of course, this is a test, important to point out, it could be potentially useful if it's combined with other tests, but alone in itself is not diagnostic. So this is some of the essence of the discussion that led to this evidence to decision table and our recommendation ultimately. Next slide. All right, so should questionnaires versus no questionnaires be used for post-exertional malaise or post-exertional symptom exacerbation screening in adults with suspected PCC? So this, like cardiac dysautonomia, this is a condition highly associated with PCC. Therefore, this was very important to consider. We know that post-exertional malaise, just as a reminder, it's an exacerbation of symptoms of PCC or others that are really exacerbated after an effort that is physical, mental, or emotional. And it could leave people really with a functional impairment for hours, days, and sometimes weeks. So a really important setback. Different questionnaires can be used to evaluate for PEM or PESE. Namely, there's several DePaul symptom questionnaires. I want to mention this. There are a lot of different DePaul symptom questionnaires available. The one that we used was the DSQ PEM short form, and this is in contrast to the DSQ short form. They're different, slightly different questionnaires. The reason why we use the DSQ PEM questionnaire is because that's where all the evidence was and all the studies were based on this test. Next slide. So the CAN-PCC collaborative suggests using questionnaires to screen for post-exertional malaise versus not using them in adults with suspected PCC. This is a conditional recommendation based on very low certainty of evidence. Next slide. Here's our evidence to decision table. So again, the benefits are judged to be moderate, the harms trivial, definitely therefore favoring the intervention in our balance of effects. And we thought that with this test, equity would probably be increased because potentially there's individuals where we might attribute symptoms of fatigue to other conditions or other situations. They would definitely therefore be screened for PEM if this test was recommended. Next slide. So again, our next recommendation complements in a sense our previous one, and it's should tools to assess functional status and quality of life, specifically the post-COVID-19 functional status scale and the Euroqual 5D or EQ5D, versus no tools be used in adults with suspected PCC who have fatigue or dizziness. So again, this is the intention here was to be able to assess health-related functional status and quality of life. So to have a tool that gives some sort of more objective measure of these two parameters and could potentially be used going forward in follow-up visits. Although I'd like to remind everyone, these recommendations are for individuals who are being evaluated initially for suspected PCC. Next slide. So the CAN-PCC collaborative suggests using tools such as the post-COVID functional status scale or the Euroqual 5D to evaluate patients with suspected PCC and dizziness or fatigue. So the strength of this recommendation is it's a conditional recommendation based on very low certainty of evidence. Okay. And here's our evidence to decision table. Again, the benefits were judged as moderate, the harms trivial, and we thought that, again, equity would be probably increased for the same reasons as for the previous recommendation. Next slide. Okay, so now we're getting into our set of tests that are more related to the pulmonary system. So should chest x-rays versus no chest x-ray be used in adults with suspected PCC who have respiratory or cardiac complaints? So again, there's lots of symptoms related to shortness of breath, dyspnea, that can be associated with radiological changes that can be seen on an X-ray, and therefore it would be important to evaluate for these in the context of individuals with suspected PCC. Next slide. So the CAN-PCC collaborative does suggest using chest X-ray in adults with suspected PCC and cardiac or respiratory symptoms. This is a conditional recommendation based on very low certainty of evidence. Next slide. Okay, so here is our evidence to decision table. A couple of things I'd like to point out here. So the benefits were small, the harms were small. So the balance of effect seems even, but actually we again weighed more towards recommending the test. This was in a sense based somewhat on the fact that all of the evidence evaluated here was in individuals who were hospitalized in the acute phase of their COVID-19 infection. So we think that the pretest probability in this population is higher, and here there could be a chance that there could be something detected on the X-ray. Of course, I'd like to emphasize that evidence is lacking for those who are not hospitalized during the acute phase of their infection. And this definitely is something that should be pursued in future investigations. So just something to point out here. Next slide. Okay, so the next is should CT of the chest versus no CT of the chest be used in adults with suspected post-COVID-19 condition who have respiratory complaints? Again, the rationale is the same As for the X-ray, patients with PCC have respiratory symptoms, and sometimes we can see evidence of an abnormality on a CT chest that may explain some of these symptoms or lead to a change in management. Next slide. So this is a dual recommendation. So bear with me. I'll explain the first and then the second. And I think the second will make a little more sense. So the CAN-PCC collaborative suggests not using a CT chest in adults with suspected PCC and respiratory symptoms who are at low risk of pulmonary complications. And I'll explain what low versus high risk is in the next slide. So this is a conditional recommendation against the test based on very low certainty of evidence. Next slide. So the CAN-PCC, this is the second recommendation, suggests using CT scans of the chest in adults with suspected PCC and respiratory symptoms who are at high risk of pulmonary complications. So high risk means individuals who have current respiratory symptoms and previously identified important abnormalities on either chest X-ray or CT chest or pulmonary function tests, or patients who were previously hospitalized during the acute phase of their COVID-19 infection with a high clinical suspicion for pulmonary disease. This is a conditional recommendation for the intervention based on very low certainty of evidence. Next slide. So here's our evidence to decision table, and we'll go to the next slide so we can make it through the next two recommendations. All right, so the 6-minute walk test with oximetry versus no 6-minute walk test with oximetry. Should we use this test in adults with suspected PCC who have cardiac or respiratory complaints? So this is a test where it's in a sense, it's a sort of an in-office stress test, okay? This is the nuance here, is that with ambulation, are there desaturations? And this could help diagnose certain pulmonary conditions like interstitial lung disease, pulmonary hypertension, or something like a chronic pulmonary embolism. So this was the rationale behind this test. Next slide. So the CAN-PCC collaborative does recommend using the 6-minute walk test with oximetry. This is a conditional recommendation for the test based on very low certainty of evidence. Next slide. Okay. So here the benefits were judged as small and the harms varies. So this is the point that I want to emphasize here, is that it should be recognized that a 6-minute walk test for people who are at risk for post-exertional malaise or post-exertional symptom exacerbation, in these contexts, the risks may outweigh the benefits. So, one thing really is a discussion has to be had. There should be really a patient-centered approach in the decision to do this test, but also considering the potential value of the test and the sort of things it can diagnose that cannot be seen on imaging because of the fact that it is a test that's done with ambulation. So there is a stress component. All right, so that's an important part to point out here. Next slide. Okay, so finally, should full pulmonary function tests versus no full pulmonary function tests be used in adults with suspected PCC who have cardiac or respiratory complaints? So again, we know that there's a lot of respiratory symptoms like dyspnea and shortness of breath in individuals with PCC. And sometimes these symptoms can be explained by diagnoses that can be made on full pulmonary function tests. So we're saying full pulmonary function tests because this includes spirometry, plethysmography, and diffusion capacity. This is in contrast to doing, sometimes we only have access to just like spirometry, for instance. So this recommendation is really on the full PFTs. Next slide. So the CAN-PCC collaborative suggests the use of full PFTs versus not using full PFTs in adults with suspected PCC and cardiac or respiratory symptoms. This is a conditional recommendation for the test based on very low certainty of evidence. Next slide. All right, so the benefits were judged as small, the harms trivial, so the balance of effects definitely weighed towards doing the test. And we thought that this test was acceptable and probably feasible, again, in situations where there is no access to a full PFD. One can consider the spirometry, but the test is really, we are really aiming for full PFTs if possible. Next slide. So in summary, the baseline evaluation of adults with confirmed or suspected PCC should include targeted history and physical exam, including regular and orthostatic vital signs, with blood tests and other testing being guided by symptoms, comorbidities, and clinical indications. The evidence-based recommendations, such as the ones we've presented today, can certainly help guide healthcare professionals in their selection of tests, especially those that are more specialized, that may increase suspicion of PCC, and of course, its associated complications or even other comorbidities. Next slide. All right, so all of our recommendations and good practice statements that have been published are available on the recommendations map or the rec map. This is available on the CAN-PCC website. It's really designed in a way to rapidly find what you're looking for. I highly recommend you have a look at this. There's really a wealth of information that's available here. And we also have available plain language recommendations that summarize these recommendations in a way that's user-friendly and in a one-page format. And here are some additional resources for patients to gain more information and information on CME-accredited webinars for healthcare professionals and other resources as well. And so now I will pass this on to Dr. Newlat to discuss any questions that our audience may have.
Thank you very much for a great presentation, and really appreciate it again, especially Heather. Thank you for joining, share your experience, and for your great work on the guideline team, of course, as one of our persons with lived experience that have really helped us despite the challenges that you encounter. And thank you, Dr. Falcone and Mustafa, for your clear presentation and information. We still have some time for questions. As mentioned at the beginning, please put them in the Q&A section of the Zoom call here. Perhaps there are some in the chat. Let me make sure I'm not missing anything. But feel free to ask any questions related to the presentation here. Okay, we have one question here in French. I will have to give this over to Dr. Falcone, so I'll put it in the chat. It's in the Q&A section. I'm not sure if you can see it.
I have the chat open.
I'll put it in the chat. Okay, sure. For everyone. Yep. My apologies. My French is not that good.
OK. So, est-ce que vous avez des recommandations en prise de suppléments naturels pour aider la COVID longue? So, the question is if we have recommendations related to taking natural supplements to help with long COVID. I'll answer in English and in French. So there are recommendations actually on this subject, but they are within the realm of the guideline team that is addressing treatment interventions, pharmacological and non-pharmacological. So some recommendations do address certain natural supplements. Donc en français, oui, il y a des recommandations. Ils sont traités par une autre équipe qui adresse les outils de prise en charge en lien avec les traitements pharmacologiques et non pharmacologiques pour la COVID longue. Il y en a qui adressent spécifiquement les suppléments naturels et vous pouvez les accéder en effet sur le site de CAN-PCC dans le rec map.
Great, thank you. Feel free to add other questions. All right, so this one I will read out for our presenters here. The recommendations were geared more towards doctors. Will more specifics for allied health be done as well? For example, physiotherapists.
I'm gonna maybe start the response to this, and Liana, please, and Heather, feel free to add. So actually, the recommendations are not intended to be focused on physicians or specific healthcare providers. However, because our guideline is specifically about diagnosis and diagnostic test, they tend to be more focused on tests, of course. And a lot of the time, these tests are either ordered or interpreted by physicians and other healthcare providers. However, some of the tests we looked at, for example, there are many times who does a specific test, like the 6-minute walk test or some of the other tests. It could certainly be the nurse, it could be somebody in respiratory therapy, it could be a physical therapist, depending on the context and the specific structure of not only the healthcare system, but the specifics of where you practice. So the intention is really to be very broad, but because it's testing, a lot of the time who's ordering the test or interpreting it happen to be either a physician or another healthcare providers who actually work in that space. And anything you would like to add, Liana or Heather?
I think that's a great explanation. And the only thing I would say is there could be some recommendations, perhaps in some of the other guideline team recommendations that may involve interventions that are, could be in the realm of some of the other healthcare professions, such as physiotherapy, for example.
Thank you for your responses. Before we wrap it up, there's one more question here. We can probably quickly address this. The question is, are you looking for more input from people with lived experience? If so, how would someone get involved? And perhaps I can address that. So within our project, every month we've been posting draft recommendations for public input. So we still have 2 to go, I believe, of surveys that you can provide your input on. In terms of more substantial participation or input, the current project will go until the end of March, and we really hope that we will find the opportunity to continue this important work and keep updating the recommendations in the future. And if that's the case, then we may put out another call for participation. So that's the current situation in terms of how you can get involved. But I would really encourage you to still respond to the surveys that are still coming out before the end of March. Thank you for the questions. I see there's more, but unfortunately we're already at the hour here. So we will take the additional questions that are here, and we can perhaps address them offline. So Ashley, if you can perhaps pull up the last few slides. There they are. So if you bear with me 1 more minute, really appreciate it. So just to reiterate, visit our website online, CAN-PCC.ca, and as was mentioned, our recommendations map, our rec map, is also there. You can find a link there. And we have other webinars coming up, as you can see here, for pharmacological and non-pharmacological clinical interventions, as well as for the prevention of post-COVID-19 condition or long COVID. So please do join us for that as well. Here you have a QR code also to stay up to date on our work. Yeah, and with that, I would like to thank you for joining us. And again, thank you to the presenters for your very clear and comprehensive presentation of this topic. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.